How can a Big Mac answer the question about which country is more expensive? Well, a Big Mac is uniform across most countries, so we can measure which country is more expensive by comparing the cost of a Big Mac in each country. This comparison, known as the Big Mac Index, and yes, this is an actual index, helps indicate the relative cost of living and purchasing power between countries. In this video, we'll investigate the differences in cost of living between the US and the EU. Which region do you think is most expensive? The first question you might ask is, how can we measure cost of living? We'll measure and score based on 5 different categories. And those categories are, drumroll please, housing cost, healthcare expenses, transportation fees, food and groceries, and last, taxes and social services. These metrics are essential as they cover significant aspects of everyday expenses, providing a well-rounded understanding of the cost of living in each region. Should we just dive in then? Well, not yet. We need to tackle one more question before we start. There are substantial differences in the cost of living between countries in the Euro area and the states in the US. For example, housing costs in California are much higher than in Ohio or, for example, Texas. We'll use averages to provide a general comparison, but keep in mind that these regional disparities are real. The same goes for the EU. Western European countries like Germany and France generally have much higher living costs compared to Eastern European countries like Poland and Hungary. We'll also use averages for the EU, but individual country differences are significant. Because the different needs vary greatly from city to city and prices and costs do the same, we'll label each category with a 3-point grade system for each region: cheap, fair, and expensive. Let's start with housing costs. When comparing housing costs between the Euro area and the US, it's essential to consider overall averages rather than specific cities to get a comprehensive understanding. Housing is typically the largest monthly expense for individuals and families, and high housing costs can actually consume a significant portion of income, affecting overall affordability and quality of life. In the Euro area, the average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in city centers is around 1,000 euros per month. But if you go outside the city center, it drops to approximately 750 euros a month. In the US, the average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in a city center is about $1,600 per month, while outside city centers, it's about $1,200. In the United States, high-cost areas like San Francisco and New York have average rents that can exceed $3,000 per month for a 1-bedroom apartment. On the other hand, in smaller cities and rural areas such as those in the Midwest, rents can be as low as $800 per month. In the Euro area, major cities like Paris can have rents around 2,500 euro per month for similar apartments. Meanwhile, in Eastern European countries like Bulgaria and Romania, average rents can be as low as 300 euros per month. To conclude on housing, we categorize the EU as fair. Housing costs in the EU are generally lower than in the US, especially outside major cities. The US, however, is categorized as expensive. High housing costs, particularly in urban areas, make the US more expensive in this category. Next, let's look at one of the most contested topics, especially if you look into most comment sections: healthcare. Healthcare systems in the US and Europe are fundamentally different. In Europe, many countries offer universal healthcare, meaning the government provides healthcare services to all residents, primarily funded through taxes. By contrast, in the US healthcare system, it's predominantly private, with a mix of private insurance, government programs, and out-of-pocket payments. Healthcare is extremely important, and it impacts your financial stability and overall well-being. Universal healthcare in Europe spreads the cost across the population, resulting in lower personal expenses. But in contrast, the US system's reliance on private insurance can lead to higher individual costs, affecting disposable income and financial security. In the Euro area, most countries have minimal out-of-pocket costs due to extensive public healthcare coverage. For example, a doctor's visit might only cost a few euros, with the majority covered by public health insurance. In the US, on the other hand, the cost of healthcare can be substantial. A doctor's visit without insurance can cost over $100, and insurance premiums can be pretty high. For example, the average annual premium for employer-sponsored healthcare insurance was about $7,470 for a single coverage and $21,342 for family coverage in 2020. I know freedom isn't free and all, but does it have to be that expensive? There are some regional variations though. In states like New York and California, healthcare costs can be higher due to higher insurance premiums and medical fees. But in states with lower cost of living like Texas and Florida, healthcare expenses can be somewhat lower but still significant compared to Europe. If we take a look at the Euro area, we can see the same dynamic, but it's a little bit different. In high-cost areas where healthcare is generally affordable, countries with higher living costs like Switzerland, which is not in the euro area technically, but often included in European comparisons, often have higher insurance premiums. But in low-cost areas in countries like Spain and Italy, there's very affordable healthcare services with minimal out-of-pocket expenses due to robust public healthcare systems. To conclude on healthcare, the EU is categorized as cheap, because universal healthcare results in lower out-of-pocket expenses for most residents. The US, on the other hand, is categorized as expensive, and that's because of the reliance on private insurance in the US leading to significantly higher healthcare costs. Transportation is usually a hot topic before elections, and especially fuel costs. Fuel can be a significant budget item, especially in suburban and rural areas. But of course, transportation is way more than fuel. Transportation systems in the US and Europe differ significantly. European cities typically have extensive, efficient public transportation networks, making it easier and cheaper to get around without a car. In contrast, many parts of the US are car dependent, leading to higher transportation costs due to car ownership, maintenance, and fuel prices. If we look at average transport costs in the euro area, public transportation is widely used and affordable. For example, a monthly pass in cities like Berlin costs around 80 to 100 euros. A monthly public transport pass in cities like New York cost about $127, but car ownership expenses, including fuel, insurance, and maintenance, can significantly add up. In the transport category, we also find some regional differences. In urban areas like Los Angeles, the lack of comprehensive public transport makes car ownership almost essential, leading to higher expenses. But in cities with better public transport or lower cost of living, like Portland or Atlanta, transportation expenses can be more manageable, but still higher than in many European cities. If we look to the euro area, cities like London have higher public transportation costs with monthly passes around £150. But in smaller cities or those with subsidized transport like Prague, monthly passes can be as low as 20 or 30 euros. To conclude on transportation, we categorize the EU as cheap/fair. Efficient and affordable public transport systems make transportation costs lower in the EU. The US is categorized as fair to expensive. Dependence on car ownership increases transportation expenses in many parts of the US. Food costs can vary wildly between regions due to differences in agricultural practices, subsidies, and cultural habits. In general, groceries tend to be cheaper in Europe, while dining out can be more expensive compared to the US. If we look at the average food and grocery costs in the euro area, groceries are often subsidized and locally produced, resulting in lower costs. For example, a loaf of bread might cost around €1.20. In the US, while some groceries might be more expensive, the cost of dining out is generally lower. A loaf of bread might cost around $2.50. Here as well, we need to highlight some regional variations. For the US, in high-cost areas like New York, grocery prices and dining out can be higher. A typical meal at a mid-range restaurant can cost around $20 to $30. In low-cost areas like smaller towns and rural areas, groceries can be more affordable, and dining out, particularly at fast food restaurants, can also be cheaper, averaging around $10 to $15 per meal. If we look to the euro area, high-cost areas in cities like Paris and Zurich, dining out can be quite expensive, with a meal at a mid-range restaurant costing around 25 to 40 euros. In low-cost areas, which means countries like Spain and Portugal, groceries are more affordable due to local production and subsidies. Dining out is also reasonably priced, with meals averaging around 10 to 20 euros. The food consumption habits in the US and Europe are pretty different. The US has a strong fast food culture, with many people opting for quick, convenient meals. This can lead to higher expenses for dining out, but lower grocery costs for those who cook at home. Meals in the US also tend to have larger portions, which can increase costs but also provide more value per meal. Looking to Europe, Europeans often prioritize fresh and locally sourced ingredients, leading to frequent trips to the markets and potentially lower grocery costs. Dining out in Europe is often seen as a social experience, with meals typically taking longer and including multiple courses, which can increase costs. To conclude on food and groceries, the EU is categorized as fair. While groceries are often cheaper due to subsidies, dining out can often be more expensive. The US is also categorized as fair because the US has varied food costs, with groceries being moderately priced and dining out being generally cheaper than in the EU. Next, let's take a look at the other big one, which is taxes and social services, which significantly impacts the cost of living in the EU and the US. Taxes and social services differ greatly between the two regions. European countries typically have higher taxes but offer extensive social services, while the US have lower taxes but fewer government-provided services. European residents face higher tax rates, often exceeding 50% in countries like Sweden. These taxes fund comprehensive social services such as universal healthcare, free or subsidized education, and a robust public infrastructure. In the US, on the other hand, federal tax rates are generally lower, with a top rate of 37%. However, there are fewer government-provided services, and individuals often need to pay out of pocket for healthcare, education, and other services. Here we can also find some regional variations. So in states like California and New York, there is higher state income tax, adding to the federal tax burden. For example, California has a top state income tax rate of 13.3%. However, the range of public services offered by these states can be more extensive. In lower tax states like Texas and Florida, there's no state income tax, reducing the overall tax burden but also offering fewer public services in comparison to high tax states. Looking to Europe, the Scandinavian countries such as Sweden and Norway have high taxes, up to 57% in Sweden. But they also offer extensive social welfare programs, including free healthcare, education, generous unemployment benefits, and public pensions. In low-tax countries like Ireland, there's lower taxes compared to the European neighbors, with a top income tax rate of 40%. This often attracts businesses, but it offers fewer social services than their Scandinavian counterparts. When looking at cost of living, taxes is a pretty important component because it directly affects disposable income, and social services can offset living costs by providing essential services. Higher taxes in Europe often correlate with comprehensive social benefits, which can reduce individual expenses on healthcare, education, and more. In contrast, the US system lowers taxes, but it results in higher out-of-pocket expenses for these services. To conclude on taxes, we categorize the EU as expensive. High taxes in the EU fund extensive social services, providing significant benefits despite the higher cost. On the other hand, we categorize the US as fair. Lower taxes but fewer public services means that individuals bear more out-of-pocket expenses for stuff like healthcare and education. To summarize our different categories, on housing costs, we categorize the EU as fair. This was because of lower housing costs, especially outside of major cities. The US was categorized as expensive due to high housing costs in urban areas. For healthcare expenses, we categorize the EU as cheap because of universal healthcare that reduces out-of-pocket expenses. The US was categorized as expensive due to reliance on private insurance that increases cost. For transportation fees, we categorize the EU as cheap/fair due to affordable public transportation. The US, on the other hand, was categorized as fair/expensive due to car ownership potentially increasing cost. For food and groceries, we categorize the EU as fair due to cheaper groceries, but dining out is pricier. The US was also categorized as fair because of moderately priced groceries but cheaper dining out. For taxes and social services, the EU was categorized as expensive, but these higher taxes fund extensive social services. The US was categorized as fair, with lower taxes but fewer public services. The EU generally benefits from lower healthcare and transportation costs, while the US faces higher housing and healthcare expenses. European countries offer extensive social services funded by higher taxes, whereas the US has lower taxes but fewer public services. So should everyone move to Europe then? Well, not so fast. It's not all sunshine and rainbows here either. Take a look at this video to understand what's wrong with Europe.